I think we could see the inflation. There's a lot of people that complain about interest rates.
When the economy is not doing great, when you support small businesses, you help the local communities also. And I haven't seen that with Biden.
Really, neither one of them deserve my vote. I almost feel like I should go some other route. Maybe somebody else will come up.
As we've been sharing with you all for months now, poll after poll shows that the Democratic Party's handling of the economy is leading to waning support among Latino voters. Now, the latest survey was done by Unidos US, and that poll is really no exception. So they didn't really talk about what it is that these voters are unhappy with Biden on. They just wanted to understand, what do Latino voters actually care about? Because there is this, in my opinion, mistake by a lot of Democratic candidates in kind of thinking they know what Latino voters are motivated by, what they're inspired by, what's gonna get them to the polls. But more often than not, what they end up doing is they treat this block of voters as a monolith, and they're not really hearing out what their main concerns are, what kind of policy issues they want addressed. And so let's talk about that in some more detail. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the margin of error for this survey is 1.8 percentage points. Pretty small margin of error considering other polling that we've talked about on this show before. But with that in mind, here's what we found. The poll asked Latinos to pick the three most important issues for Congress to address. Inflation and the rising cost of living were named by 54% of Latinos. Jobs and the economy came in second at 44%, and healthcare was third at 33%. So let's keep it real, ladies and gentlemen. Those are all bread and butter issues. At the same time, what you typically hear from Democratic candidates attempting to appeal to Latino voters is just nonstop emphasis on social issues, which they do care about. But to assume that they care about those issues, like immigration, for instance, far more than they care about their own economic well-being, I think is misguided, to say the least. And it's unfounded based on what we're seeing in the polls. Of those surveyed, by the way, 47% approve of how President Joe Biden has been handling his job, while 44% disapprove. So this polling, to some extent, is a little mixed, because previous polling of Latino voters showed a lot more unhappiness, if you will, in regard to how Joe Biden has been handling his job. So in this poll, there are more Latino voters who are happy with how he's handling his job versus those who are unhappy with it. Clarissa Martinez de Castro, who is the vice president of Latino Vote and of the Latino Vote Initiative at Unidos US, says that given the income levels of the majority of the Latino population, pocketbook issues and economic concerns are driving the list of more deeply felt concerns at the moment, and notably that housing, this is important, guys, housing as a standalone issue has reached the top 5. Look, in the area of housing, I haven't seen anything from the Biden administration at all. And that is a big problem. Because when we talk about inflation, sure, you're experiencing inflation at the grocery store, you experience some inflation at the gas pump, and that's really something that Biden doesn't have a lot of control over. You know, gas prices really have more to do with the OPEC plus cartel, the oil producing countries, and the fact that many of them can decide to withhold production of oil, which will then drive down the supply and will increase the price at the pump as a result. But Biden could actually implement some policies that could alleviate the pain that Americans are feeling in regard to housing. For instance, he could push for legislation or maybe even consider an executive order that prevents, declares a national emergency in regard to housing. Once you do that as a president, you actually have a lot more leeway in terms of policy. You can kind of skirt the gridlock that you see in Congress all the time. And you can push for bans on foreigners in investing in residential real estate here in the United States as an investment vehicle when they have no interest in actually living here. You can also ban private equity firms from buying up entire neighborhoods of residential homes. You can do all sorts of things, but the Biden administration, of course, has been very hands-off, in my opinion, when it comes to the housing crisis. And that is now becoming more and more of a political liability. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm happy to see that. Because the only way politicians are ever going to listen to our concerns is if they see that ignoring our concerns is tantamount to political suicide. And so I hope this becomes more and more of an issue to the point where politicians have no choice but to finally, in a very robust way, address the real housing crisis that Americans are grappling with as we speak. Now, there's more. So about half of Latino support providing a path to citizenship for immigrants who came to the United States when they were children. That's actually a lower percentage than I would have expected. So even I thought that more Latinos wanted to do something for the Dreamers. But you also have to keep in mind, it is a mistake, in my opinion, to assume that all Latinos here are totally cool with the way the immigration system is working. A lot of them actually came here and went through an incredibly difficult process to become legal citizens. And so you gotta understand that component of it as well. When it comes to Immigration and Border Patrol, that actually ranks 6th in this poll. So that is not the #1 priority. It doesn't even make the top 5 for Latino voters. But the poll also found that most Latinos do not believe that Republicans would do a better job when it comes to the economy either. Asked who would better address the issue of inflation and the rising cost of living, 39% of Latinos surveyed said Democrats and 21% said Republicans. 51% said they would vote or lean toward voting for Biden if he were in a head-to-head race with Trump in the 2024 presidential election, compared to 33% for Trump. In Florida, Trump got a larger share of Latino voters, 45% to Biden's 39%, while Biden did best in Pennsylvania, 58% to 26%, the poll found. So that's the other thing. I mean, if you take a look at the Latino vote as a whole and look at what the popular vote is likely gonna be, Biden still does pretty well among Latino voters. But you should also consider the fact that we decide elections based on the Electoral College, and the Latino population is not a monolith. Latino voters in Florida, who mostly consist of Venezuelans, Cubans, they tend to be far more conservative. So that's part of the reason why Democrats don't tend to do well in Florida these days when it comes to the presidential election. And remember, we've talked about other polls that have come out recently that have far worse results for Biden, including that New York Times Siena College poll, which found that the majority of Hispanics thought former President Donald Trump would do a better job on the economy, but that was based on responses from 235 Hispanic registered voters. And a Univision poll of 1,400 Hispanic registered voters conducted in September found that just 27% of the Latino registered voters polled believed Biden had a plan to deal with the cost of living and inflation, while 30% said they'd heard a little about his plan, but weren't sure it would deal with those issues. About a third said they didn't believe Biden had such a plan. Now, I know what the Biden defenders are gonna say. Oh, but he passed this groundbreaking legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Build Back Better, which of course was watered down considerably. But remember, even the so-called good provisions of those bills basically lead to more of this public-private partnership where private companies get grants from the federal government in order to carry out infrastructure projects or carry out certain programs that are supposed to help the needy in the country. But when you do that, the money tends to get misused, and the help for ordinary Americans tends to be watered down. And so we warned about that as the debates over this legislation were ongoing. We warned that rather than having the government carry out these services, ensuring that they're doing this without private corporations' involvement, that's gonna be a political liability in the long run, because the positive results of this legislation might be felt somewhere down the line, especially when it comes to the building or improvement of infrastructure, but might not even reach the Americans that it's supposed to reach, because again, it relies on private companies to carry out these services. And we know that there's money that gets misused. We know that they're slow to act and do what they're supposed to do in terms of following through with what they're promising as a result of these contracts that have been given to them by the federal government. So if you take a look at how Americans are talking about the economy, it's not good enough to simply say, oh, well, there is a record low unemployment rate. Okay, fine, but how are Americans able to pay their bills given the amount of money they are making through the work that they have? Are they making enough to afford housing? Are they making enough to afford, groceries and gas and all of that? If they're working hard and they're still unable to cover their bills, if anything, hearing Biden talk about Bidenomics and how wonderful the economy is, it's gonna anger them rather than persuade them that Biden's doing his job correctly or actually looking out for them and their best interests.
Thanks for watching. If you become a member, you get to watch all this ad-free, except for, of course, this ad. Still, hit the join button below.